I still get chills thinking about what happened that night. It's one of those memories that feels more like a nightmare, but I know it really happened. I was driving home from a weekend trip with my best friend. We'd been out in the countryside, so it was a long drive back to the city. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the road was deserted. No other cars, no streetlights, just a stretch of highway lit by my headlights. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something up ahead on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was just debris or an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing the road. I slowed down instinctively, trying to get a better look. Something about the way they were standing gave me an uneasy feeling. It was too rigid, almost unnatural. I debated whether to pull over, but something in my gut told me not to. As I passed by, I glanced over and saw the person more clearly. It was a man, maybe in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He didn't look at my car as I drove past. He just stood there, staring straight ahead. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe his car broke down, or he was waiting for someone. But about 5 minutes later, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. The car was far enough behind me that I couldn't make out the details, but then it started speeding up, getting closer and closer. My heart started racing as the car came right up behind me, almost tailgating. I switched lanes to let them pass, but instead of going around me, the car stayed right behind me. It didn't feel like an accident or a coincidence. I decided to test it. I changed lanes again, moving to the far left lane. The car followed. I switched back to the middle lane. It followed again. By this point, I was full on panicking. I knew I couldn't stop, not on an empty highway in the middle of the night. I tried to stay calm and focus on driving, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. The car behind me flashed its high beams, momentarily blinding me. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't random. Someone was messing with me, and it wasn't harmless. I remembered seeing a sign for a rest area a few miles back, so I decided to head there. I figured it would be safer to stop somewhere with other people around than to keep driving with this car following me. I kept glancing in the mirror, and the car stayed right behind me the entire time. When I finally pulled into the rest area, I was relieved to see a few other cars parked there. I drove straight to the far end of the lot, as close to the building as I could get. The other car pulled in too, but it didn't park. It just idled near the entrance, its headlights still on. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to decide what to do. Getting out of the car didn't seem like a good idea, but I didn't want to just sit there either. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? A car was following me? After what felt like an eternity, the other car finally started moving. It drove past my car slowly, almost as if the driver was looking for something. Then it turned and pulled back onto the highway. I waited a few minutes before leaving the rest area, just to be sure the coast was clear. When I got back on the road, I didn't see the car again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see those headlights again. Even when I finally made it home, I couldn't relax. I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows and stayed up most of the night, too wired to sleep. The scariest part is not knowing who that person was or what they wanted. Was it the same man I saw on the side of the road? If so, how did he get back into a car so quickly? To this day, I avoid driving alone at night. It's been years, but every time I'm on a dark highway, I find myself glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, and every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror, my heart skips a beat. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pulled into that rest area. Maybe nothing. Maybe something much worse. All I know is that I'll never take my safety for granted again. Last summer, my girlfriend and I decided to go camping. We'd been talking about it for ages, and we finally had the time to do it. It wasn't anything crazy, just a weekend getaway to one of those state parks with marked trails and designated campsites. We're not hardcore outdoor enthusiasts or anything, we just wanted to disconnect for a bit and enjoy nature. The drive there was great. We had the car packed with snacks, gear, and some camping essentials we borrowed from my dad. The plan was to hike out to one of the more secluded campsites and just relax for a couple of days. When we arrived, the place was perfect. There were only a few cars in the parking lot, and the trail we picked seemed quiet. After about an hour of hiking, we found our site. It was tucked away near a small stream, surrounded by tall pines. It felt private, which was exactly what we wanted. We spent the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the area. There wasn't much around except for the trees and the stream, but that was part of the charm. We made a small fire as the sun started to set, roasted marshmallows, and just talked. It was nice, peaceful. By the time it got dark, we were both ready to call it a night. We crawled into the tent, zipped up the door, and settled in. I remember falling asleep pretty quickly, but that didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling sound, but it was enough to snap me out of my sleep. A raccoon or something digging around our site. I laid there listening, trying not to wake my girlfriend. The rustling stopped for a moment, and I figured whatever it was had left. But then I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves just outside our tent. My heart started racing. Animals don't walk like that. This was a person. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to unzip the tent and look, but another part of me didn't want to give away that we were awake. I just froze, holding my breath, hoping whoever it was would move on. The footsteps circled the tent. I could hear them getting closer, then farther away, then closer again. It felt like they were deliberately checking us out, maybe trying to decide if we were worth bothering. I gently nudged my girlfriend to wake her up. She stirred, and I whispered to her as quietly as I could that someone was outside. She tensed up immediately, and I could feel her clutching my arm. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. I thought maybe they'd left, but then we heard it. Breathing. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside our tent. I could hear the faint sound of their breathing, steady and shallow. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. I grabbed the only thing I could think of, a flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I switched it on and pointed it at the wall of the tent, hoping the light would scare them off. The breathing stopped, and I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the tent. They were quicker now, like whoever it was had decided to leave. We stayed frozen for what felt like hours, too afraid to move or make a sound. Eventually, the forest went quiet again. No footsteps, no breathing, just the usual sounds of the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither did my girlfriend. We just laid there, listening, waiting for any sign that they might come back. As soon as the sun came up, we packed up our stuff as quickly as we could. The whole time I felt like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was no one there. When we finally got back to the parking lot, there was only one other car. It was an old, beat-up sedan with tinted windows. I couldn't see inside, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I don't know if it belonged to the person who was at our campsite, but something about it didn't feel right. We drove straight home without stopping. The whole way back, I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was that person? What did they want? The scariest part is that they didn't try to hurt us or steal anything. They didn't say a word. They just walked around our tent breathing like they were trying to scare us, or worse, like they were deciding what to do. We haven't been camping since. I'd always thought of the woods as this peaceful, safe place, but now I see it differently. It's not the animals you have to worry about. It's the people. Every now and then I think about that night and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned on the flashlight. Would they have left on their own, or would they have come inside? I don't know, and honestly I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never go camping again without some kind of protection. A flashlight is one thing, but next time I'll have something a lot more convincing, just in case. There was A couple of years ago, I had to drive back home late at night after visiting a friend in a small town about 3 hours away. The route was mostly back roads and lonely highways, which didn't bother me at first. I figured it would just be a quiet drive with some music to keep me company. About halfway through the trip, I noticed my gas tank was lower than I thought. I must have miscalculated how much fuel I had left before leaving my friend's place. I wasn't too worried though. There's always a gas station somewhere, even out in the middle of nowhere. Sure enough, after another 10 minutes of driving, I saw the glowing sign for an old gas station up ahead. It looked a little run down, but it was open, so I pulled in. There were no other cars around, just my headlights lighting up the cracked asphalt and the flickering neon open sign in the window. I parked by one of the pumps and got out to fill up. The air was still and quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. As I started pumping gas, I noticed a man standing near the corner of the building, partially hidden in the shadows. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching me. At first I thought maybe he was the clerk on a break or something, but something about the way he stood made me uneasy. He was too still, like he was waiting for something. I tried to ignore him and focus on the pump, but my eyes kept darting back to where he was. He didn't move, just kept staring. That's when I noticed a second man, closer to the side of the building, also watching me. My heart started racing. Two men, both standing in the shadows, just staring at me in the middle of nowhere. It didn't feel right. I decided to stop pumping gas, even though the tank wasn't full, and get back in my car. As I turned to put the nozzle back, I saw the first man take a step toward me. Then another. The second man moved too, coming around the side of the building. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I yanked the nozzle out of my car, shoved it back onto the pump, and jumped into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, speeding out of the station without even closing the fuel cap. In my rearview mirror, I could see the two men standing in the middle of the lot, watching me drive away. They didn't chase me, but the sight of them just standing there sent a chill down my spine. I drove for a while, trying to shake off the adrenaline. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road stayed empty. After about 20 minutes, I saw another gas station up ahead. This one was better lit and had a couple of cars parked outside. I decided to stop and fill up properly this time. As I pulled in, I noticed a sheriff's cruiser parked near the entrance. The sight of it was reassuring. I went inside to pay, and the clerk greeted me with a friendly smile. The normalcy of it all was a huge relief. I mentioned to the clerk that I had stopped at another gas station earlier and seen two men acting strangely. I didn't go into too much detail, just said that they had made me uncomfortable. The clerk's expression changed immediately. He asked which station I was talking about, and when I described it, he nodded slowly. He said that place had a bad reputation. There had been reports of people being harassed there, even a couple of robberies. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I had no idea how close I might have been to something really bad happening. The clerk told me I was smart to trust my instincts and leave. He said that a lot of people ignore that gut feeling and end up regretting it. I thanked him, finished filling up, and got back on the road as quickly as I could. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror made my heart race. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a few minutes, just trying to calm down. My house felt safe, but the memory of those men standing in the shadows stuck with me. To this day, I wonder what their intentions were. Were they just messing with me, trying to scare me? Or were they planning something worse? I'll never know, and honestly, I'm okay with that. That night taught me to always trust my gut. If something feels off, it probably is. I also learned to never let my gas tank get that low again, especially when driving through unfamiliar territory. It's scary to think how quickly a normal situation can turn dangerous. One minute you're filling up your car, and the next you're speeding away from something you can't explain. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't reacted the way I did. Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything. All I know is that I got out of there, and that's all that matters. I used to love jogging in the evenings, especially after a long day at work. The fresh air, the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the ground, and the solitude all helped me clear my head. My neighborhood was pretty quiet, with lots of tree-lined streets and a small park nearby. It felt safe, even when the sun dipped below the horizon. That feeling of safety, though, almost cost me everything one night. It started out like any other run. I laced up my sneakers, stretched on the front porch, and headed down my usual route. I always took the main roads first, looping around the neighborhood before cutting through the park on my way back home. It wasn't a big park, just a small patch of green space with a few benches, a playground, and a walking path that connected one side to the other. That night, as I jogged through the park, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. Normally there'd be a dog walker or a couple of kids hanging around the playground, but this time there was nothing, just me and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was just the time of day. Most people were probably home eating dinner or watching TV. About halfway through the park, I saw a man sitting on one of the benches. He was hunched over, his head down, like he was scrolling through his phone or tying his shoe. I didn't think much of it at first. People sat in the park all the time. But as I got closer, something about him felt off. He wasn't moving, not even shifting in his seat, just sitting there, completely still. My instincts told me to stay alert, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just having a bad day, needing some time alone. I kept jogging, my pace steady, but as I passed him, I swear I felt his eyes on me. I didn't look directly at him, but I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my back. My heart rate picked up, and not just from the running. I glanced over my shoulder a few seconds later, and that's when I saw him. He was standing now, watching me from the bench. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but his posture was rigid, like he was ready to move. I turned my head back around, trying not to panic. Maybe he was just stretching his legs, I told myself. Maybe he was about to leave the park. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I picked up my pace, my feet hitting the ground harder and faster. The path curved up ahead, leading toward the park exit and back into the neighborhood. I told myself that once I was out of the park and back on the street, I'd feel safer. But then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. They were faint at first, like someone trying to walk quietly, but as I sped up, so did they. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to know for sure, but I had to. Turning my head, I saw him again. He was following me, his strides long and deliberate. He wasn't jogging like I was, but he was moving quickly enough to close the distance between us. At that moment, every true crime story I'd ever heard came flooding into my brain. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I broke into a full sprint, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the park. The path felt endless, the trees on either side closing in like walls. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster. He was chasing me. There was no denying it now. I reached the park exit and burst onto the sidewalk, my lungs screaming for air. For a split second, I thought about stopping to catch my breath, but the thought of him catching up to me pushed me forward. My house was still a few blocks away, but I knew I couldn't go straight there. What if he followed me? What if he saw where I lived? I needed to lose him first. I veered off my usual route, taking random turns through the neighborhood. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it wasn't anywhere near him. My only goal was to put as much distance between us as possible. Eventually, I ducked into a small alleyway between two houses, crouching behind a row of trash cans. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might give me away. I waited, straining my ears for any sound. For a while, all I heard was my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps again. They were slower now, more deliberate, like he was searching. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come down the alley. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded. I stayed hidden for a while longer just to be sure. When I finally peeked out, the street was empty. I made my way home as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch, my whole body trembling. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. What if I hadn't run fast enough? What if I hadn't found a place to hide? The next morning, I went to the local police station and reported what happened. They took my statement and said they'd patrol the park more often, but I could tell they didn't think much would come of it. I never saw that man again, but I stopped jogging at night after that. Even during the day, I couldn't bring myself to run through the park anymore. It just didn't feel safe. That experience changed the way I see the world. It's scary how quickly an ordinary night can turn into something straight out of a nightmare. You think you're safe, that nothing bad could ever happen to you, until it does. Now I always trust my gut. If something feels off, I don't ignore it, and I always stay aware of my surroundings. Because you never know who might be watching, or following. There was some